Have you ever felt something watching you before you saw it? Not the prickling embarrassment of being caught staring at your phone in a meeting. Not the warm awareness of a lover's gaze from across a room. Something older than that. Something that lives in the part of your brain that was never asked to think, only to survive. A cold, animal certainty that rises up through the soles of your feet and settles in the back of your throat like a word you cannot swallow and cannot say. You scan a parking lot at night and see nothing. You pause at the top of a staircase for a reason you don't understand. You sit up in bed at 3 in the morning with your heart going like a hammer and the room perfectly, utterly still, and you tell yourself it was just a dream. You tell yourself you're being ridiculous. You reach over and turn the lamp on. And some part of you, not the rational part, not the educated, coffee-drinking, bill-paying part, some deeper part goes very quiet and waits. Most of us have learned to dismiss that part. We've been rewarded for dismissing it. We live in a world that hands out trophies for skepticism and builds hospitals for people who listen too closely to instinct. We explain everything. We contextualize, we rationalize, we sleep with white noise machines and prescription sedatives, and we get very good at the language of disbelief. But horses can't do that. And that's what makes this story so difficult to let go of. Her name was Miriam Calloway, and she had ridden that trail more times than she could count. She knew every bend. She knew the way the birch trees thinned near the Second Creek crossing, how the mud got treacherous after rain, where the roots had buckled up through the packed earth to form a little staircase that her mare, Sable, always climbed with the same offended dignity, as if the ground had personally insulted her. Miriam knew the smell of it in September, wet pine and something sweet underneath, like old apples no one had bothered to collect. She knew the sound it made in the hour before dusk, when the sparrows stopped and the world held its breath before the owl started up. She had been riding that trail since she was 11 years old, first on her grandmother's old gelding who moved like a sun-warmed boulder, then on every horse she'd owned in the 32 years since. 6 horses. 6 different temperaments, 6 different relationships with the world. And not one of them had ever done what Sable did that October evening. She had gone out later than she meant to. That was how she always told it, later than she meant to. As if that detail mattered. As if the fog cared about her schedule. The fog had come in faster than the forecast suggested. That afternoon, the weather app on her phone had showed a clear evening with a slight chance of mist after 10. It was barely past 7 when the first tendrils of white began threading through the lower reaches of the trail, rising from the creek bed like something slowly exhaling. By 7:15, it had swallowed the tree line. By 7:30, Miriam could see perhaps 15 feet ahead of her, and the world had become a narrow tunnel of gray-white murk and the soft thud of Sable's hooves on the damp earth. She wasn't worried, not exactly. She had her phone. She knew the trail. The markers were spaced close enough that she could navigate on muscle memory alone if she had to. She'd ridden in worse conditions, rain that came sideways off the hills, sleet that turned the November trails into glass, and Sable was steady. That was what you always said about Sable. That mare is steady. Even the vet said it, the way you say a good thing about someone at a funeral. Steady. Reliable. The kind of horse that doesn't rattle. And then the horse stopped. Not gradually. Not the slow, questioning halt of an animal that had spotted a branch it wasn't sure about, or caught a scent on the edge of something interesting. Sable stopped the way a machine stops when you cut the power. Completely. All at once. Her hooves hit the earth and did not move again. Miriam felt it before she understood it, a vibration. Not from the ground. From the horse herself. The way a struck bell hums after the blow, Sable's entire body was trembling with something that moved through her ribs and up through the reins and into Miriam's palms. A deep, interior trembling. Not fear the way horses usually showed fear, which was all kinetic energy, the dance, the sidestep, the roll of white around the eye, the desperate urge toward motion. This was the opposite of motion. This was absolute, rooted stillness, with only that fine trembling to show that anything was happening at all. Sable's nostrils flared, open wide. She drew a long, slow breath of the fog and then, very precisely, very deliberately, let it out in a sharp, rhythmic snort. Once, twice, both directed at the wall of white directly ahead. Miriam squinted, shifted her weight. The fog moved the way fog moves, that slow, ambiguous churning that makes everything look like it might be something. She saw the dark shapes of branches, a suggestion of ground. Nothing else. She pressed her heels gently to Sable's flanks and said the word she always used. A short, soft word, barely a word, more of a sound, the same sound her grandmother had used, a kind of low click at the back of the throat that meant forward, that meant I'm here, that meant we're fine, keep going. She had used that sound in lightning storms. She had used it when a deer crashed across the trail 6 feet in front of them. She had used it at the edge of a collapsed bridge that neither of them had seen coming, and Sable had listened every time. Sable planted her feet. It was the most deliberate thing Miriam had ever felt a horse do. Not reluctance, not hesitation, refusal. The kind of refusal that has nothing to do with being disobedient and everything to do with knowing something you don't. The kind of refusal that comes from a place so deep in the animal's architecture that there isn't a command in the world that can reach it. Miriam looked again at the fog. And then she saw it. A shape, tall and thin, standing perhaps 10 feet ahead, emerging from the white like a word forming on a fogged window. It was upright. It had the general proportions of a person. There was something at the top that might have been a head, something below that suggested shoulders, limbs extending downward. But the way it moved, the way it had moved to get there, she realized, because she had not seen it approach, it had simply appeared in the way that things in fog appear, as if the world was choosing to reveal them rather than them choosing to move. The gait was wrong. The angles were wrong. The geometry of how it carried itself was subtly, persistently, stomach-turningly wrong in the way that uncanny things are wrong. Like a photograph that has been digitally altered so slightly that you can't name the manipulation, but your eyes won't stop sliding back to it, looking for the seam. It stopped. 10 feet away. And the silence was enormous. Later, Miriam would try to describe that silence to people and they would nod politely and say yes, the woods can be very quiet, and she would say no, you don't understand. She would say this wasn't the quiet of an absence of sound. It was the quiet that you get when something is listening so hard that it has somehow absorbed the sound around it. The way a person who is concentrating very intensely goes still. The way a held breath has a different quality than an empty room. The silence had texture. It had weight. She could hear her own heartbeat in it, and the sound of it embarrassed her in a way she couldn't explain, as if her heart was saying something out loud that she hadn't meant to say. The shape stood perfectly still. And then it made a sound. A snort. Short, rhythmic, sharp, identical in cadence and pitch to the sound Sable had made moments before. Not an approximation. Not a rough, fumbling imitation. Exact. The way a recording is exact. But coming from somewhere inside the shape, from somewhere that sounded hollow, like a sound produced in a chamber that was not quite the right size or shape for that sound. A chest that wasn't a chest making a breath that wasn't a breath producing a perfect copy of something that was supposed to be animal, supposed to be alive, supposed to carry meaning inside it rather than wearing meaning like a mask. Miriam did not make a decision. Her hands moved and Sable moved and they were turning before anything that could be called thought had happened. She told herself later that it had been a sensible response. She told herself she'd been tired, that the fog had distorted things, that sound carries strangely in moisture-thick air, that there was a reasonable explanation, an animal she hadn't recognized, a person with an unusual way of moving, a trick of the light in the fog in her own overwrought mind. She told herself all of this. She rode hard for 3 minutes, maybe 4, before she realized her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. And she didn't look back. Not once. That was the thing she came back to, over and over, in the years that followed. She was not someone who looked away from things. She was practical, competent, the kind of woman who had set her own broken finger once because the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away and she had animals to feed. She had pulled her own father's body from a ditch after a tractor accident when she was 17 years old, and she had done it alone, and she had done it calmly, and she had called the ambulance and given them directions and waited in the cold. She was not a person who looked away. But she did not look back into that fog. Not because she was afraid of what she might see. Because she was afraid of what might be looking back. If this story is landing somewhere real for you, if you've ever had a moment where some deep, wordless part of you knew something before the rest of you caught up, you are not alone in that. That's actually what we're doing here, in these late night hours, in these quiet spaces between the ordinary things. We're sitting with the parts of experience that don't fit neatly into daylight. If this feels like your kind of company, stay. Like this video, and let's keep walking together. We're a quiet family here, and there's always room at the edge of the fire. Now, let's talk about what Miriam did next. Because the story doesn't end with the fog. It never does. For 3 days, she told no one. This was partly habit. Miriam had spent the better part of her adult life being the competent one, the one who held things together, and you don't get to be that person by telephoning your friends every time something frightens you. It was partly, too, a kind of self-protection. She knew how it would sound. She had a pretty good idea of the shape the conversation would take, the careful neutrality on the other person's face, the very reasonable suggestions about lighting and exhaustion, and perhaps needing to think about whether she should be riding alone in the evenings at this point in the year. But it was also something else. Something more honest. It was that she hadn't figured out yet what had happened. And Miriam was not, had never been, the kind of person who told a story she didn't understand. She needed to hold it for a while. Turn it around in the light. Look at it from different angles until she knew what it was. What she kept coming back to was the imitation. Not the shape itself. She had given herself permission to be uncertain about the shape, to file it in the category of things the fog in her own adrenaline could explain. She had grown up in these hills. She knew that fog did things to the visual cortex that were hard to predict, that it could take a deer and make it monstrous, could take a fallen log and make it human. She'd heard stories from every old-timer on every farm for 20 miles around. The fog does things to you. That she could hold. But the sound. She had heard that sound come out of Sable. She had heard Sable make that sound toward the shape. And then she had heard the shape make that sound back. And the sound had been, she kept returning to this word, kept pressing against it the way you press on a bruise to see if it's real, empty. The snort had been acoustically correct. Rhythmically correct. Temporally correct. And completely, utterly empty of anything that should have been inside it. The way a piece of music played on a synthesizer is acoustically similar to the same piece played on a real violin, but is missing something that you feel rather than hear. A quality of aliveness. A quality of intention. It had been the sound of something that had learned what the sound was for without understanding what the sound meant. On the 4th day, she called her cousin Dara. Dara was 8 years younger than Miriam and lived in the city now, worked in something related to tech that Miriam never quite understood, and had grown up spending summers on her grandmother's farm and therefore had the same baseline relationship with the natural world as Miriam, which is to say she took it seriously. Dara was not the kind of person to explain away a horse's instinct. She also wasn't the kind of person to immediately start talking about supernatural entities, which was a relief. "Tell me the whole thing," Dara said. "Don't edit it." So Miriam told her. The fog and the timing. The way Sable stopped. The trembling, and she stressed this, the trembling, because it was the detail that still didn't sit right with her. The shape. The silence. The sound. Dara was quiet for a long time after Miriam finished. "You said it was perfect," she said finally. "Yes." "The imitation." "Yes." "And it came from the wrong place." "From inside it." "Yes." Another pause. "Miriam," Dara said slowly, "I'm not going to tell you what that was. I don't know what that was. But I will say this. There are things documented, not fringe stuff, real ethological research, about how certain animals and certain other things in nature use acoustic mimicry. Not just birds. Other things. And the mechanism matters. When an animal imitates a sound to attract prey, or to signal something, or to, and this is the part one keep thinking about, to test whether what it's interacting with is what it appears to be." She paused again. The snort was Sable's sound. That's how horses communicate alertness to each other. It's a warning sound. It means, "I've seen something, and we should be prepared." "I know what it means," Miriam said. "I know you know," Dara said. "What I'm asking is, who is it warning?" Miriam set the phone down on the table after the call and sat in her kitchen for a long time, watching the light change on the hill outside the window. The question was not a new one. She had been circling it, she realized, for 4 days. Had the shape made that sound for her? Had it seen Miriam on the horse and produced the horse's own warning call back at them, the way a child might wave back at someone who waves at them without understanding what the wave is for? Had it been a kind of response, or reciprocation, or reflection? Had it heard a sound from Sable and, in whatever it used instead of a mind, decided that the appropriate thing to do was give the sound back? Or had it been for something else? Had there been something in the fog behind Miriam that it was warning her about? She sat with that second possibility for a while. It was worse, she found, in a specific way. The first possibility, the thing reflecting her horse's sound back at her without understanding it, had a quality of rawness that was dreadful because of what it implied about the thing's nature. The second possibility, the thing warning her, genuinely warning her, using the only language available, had a quality of rawness that was dreadful because of what it implied about everything else. She went out and checked on Sable that evening as the sun went down. The mare was in the paddock, eating with the concentrated attention that horses give to food, and she lifted her head when Miriam came to the fence and walked over slowly, which was unusual. Sable was not generally a horse who came to you. She pressed her broad forehead against Miriam's shoulder and stood there, breathing. "What did you see?" Miriam asked her. Sable briefed. The evening was clear, the sky going amber and rose at the edge, and the hills were visible for miles in every direction. "Was it trying to be one of us?" Miriam asked, very quietly, "or was it trying to warn us?" The mare didn't answer. Of course she didn't. But she stayed with her head against Miriam's shoulder for longer than she usually would have, and eventually Miriam put her hand on the warm curve of Sable's jaw, and they stood together until the light was completely gone. There is something about this story that keeps working on people. Miriam told it, eventually, told it to Dara, then to a few other people she trusted, then wider, the way stories spread when they carry something true inside them. And the response was always the same in its general shape, even if the specifics varied. People wanted to immediately classify it. They reached for their nearest available framework, the paranormal, the psychological, the ecological, and tried to fit the story inside it, the way you try to close an overfull suitcase. And none of the frameworks quite latched. That's the thing about genuinely strange experiences. They resist taxonomy. They won't behave like the stories we already have for them. But there was something else in the response that Miriam noticed. Underneath the reaching for frameworks, underneath the reflexive skepticism or the reflexive credulity, there was almost always a moment, sometimes brief, sometimes longer, where the person went quiet. Where something in them recognized something in the story. Not the specifics. Not the fob or the horse or the shape. The moment of the horse refusing to move. Every single person, without exception, understood that moment in their body rather than their head. They knew what it felt like when something beneath conscious thought grabbed the wheel. When the animal in you, the old, honest, pre-verbal animal, stood its ground against all the forward momentum of your daily self and said, no. Here. Stop. Look. And most of them, when they sat with it long enough, admitted that they'd had a moment like that. Not necessarily with horses or fog. Maybe at the threshold of a relationship they should have ended sooner, feeling the resistance before they had the language for it. Maybe at a job they took anyway, ignoring the pit in their stomach. Maybe at a door they stood at for just a second too long before going through. The horse stops. The question is whether you listen. Miriam listened. She went back to the trail. It took her until the following spring, nearly 7 months. She told herself it was logistics, it was weather, it was various reasons that made perfect sense and that she mostly didn't believe. In truth, she was waiting until she felt ready, and she wasn't sure she ever felt ready, so eventually she simply got up one Saturday morning in April when the sky was the clean, washed blue that follows a week of rain, and she tacked up Sable, and they went. The trail looked, in the April morning, exactly as it always had. The birch trees were coming into their new green. The mud was thick from the rain, and Sable picked her way through it with her usual offended dignity. The creek was running high and cheerful at the second crossing, and Miriam dismounted and let Sable drink, and she stood on the bank and listened to the water and the birds and the wind and the new leaves. She rode to the place where they had stopped. She was almost certain it was the right place. There was a distinctive stand of 3 birch trees together, and a particular boulder half buried in the hillside, and she had been matching landmarks since she turned onto this section of the trail. She stopped Sable and sat very still and looked at the empty trail ahead. In the April light, in the birdsong and the warmth, it was simply a trail. It was simply trees and earth and the ordinary beauty of a morning in the hills. There was nothing remarkable about it, except that Sable walked past it without hesitating. No trembling. No halt. No flared nostrils. She walked past the spot where Miriam was almost certain she had stopped, and kept going without so much as a flick of the ear. Miriam let her go. Didn't pull her back. Didn't stop. But she looked. She looked at the trail ahead where the birch trees made their parallel lines along the path, and the shadows were soft between them, and there was nothing there, and she made herself hold the looking until the nothing had been nothing for long enough to count. Then she turned her eyes to the place where the shape had stood. Just ground. Just the same damp earth and the same roots and the last of the winter's leaves still pressed against the base of the trees by months of rain. A raven called from somewhere high above and she didn't flinch. The raven called again, moved off, was gone. She put her heels to Sable's flanks. They kept going. But she did not, she realized, feel the way she'd expected to feel. She'd expected relief. She'd expected the particular quality of relief that comes when a fear is demonstrated to be unfounded, that specific combination of slight embarrassment and genuine physical ease, the loosening of something you've been holding too tightly. She'd expected to think, there. It was nothing. You were exhausted and the fog was strange and Sable was spooked by a deer or a person out walking and you let your imagination do the rest. She didn't feel that. What she felt was something more complicated. Not residual fear, exactly. More like the feeling of passing a place where something important happened, even if you can't fully name what happened. The particular way a location accumulates when events have occurred in it. The way a hospital room is different from an ordinary room even after the person who lay in it is recovered and gone home. Even after the sheets are changed. Even after the window is opened and the air is ordinary air. The place had weight. Not a bad weight. Not necessarily. Just a weight. She thought about what Dara had said. About acoustic mimicry. About signals and warnings and the question of who the signal was for. She thought about Sable's trembling, the depth of it, the quality that was unlike ordinary fear. She thought about the sound. The hollow, exact, empty sound. And she thought about a particular moment from her childhood that she hadn't thought about in years, a moment she hadn't connected to any of this until now, riding through the April morning with the birds and the new leaves and the creek behind her. She'd been 9. She and her grandmother had been walking the fence line at the back of the property, a chore they did together every spring. And her grandmother had stopped at a corner post and stood very still, the way old farmers sometimes stop, not dramatically, just a complete inefficient stillness, and she'd looked out over the field on the other side of the fence. "What is it?" Miriam had asked. Her grandmother had been quiet for a while. "There's something watching from the tree line," she'd said, finally. "Not a person. Something that wants to know what we are." Miriam had looked at the tree line, 40 yards of old maples and undergrowth, and she'd seen nothing. The field between them and the trees was empty. Nothing moved. "How do you know?" she'd asked. "Because of the way the field feels," her grandmother had said. And then, before Miriam could ask what that meant, "Because I've walked this fence line for 40 years and I know how it feels when nothing is watching, and this is not that." They had walked back to the house. Her grandmother had never mentioned it again. Young Miriam had almost completely forgotten it, or thought she had. The way you forget things that don't fit into the story you're building about the world. Now, riding through the April morning with the weight of that spot behind her, she thought about her grandmother standing at the corner post. She thought about Sable standing in the fog. She thought about all the times the animal had known first. She thought about what it cost us, collectively, to learn to talk ourselves out of that knowing. What we built in its place. All the excellent and extraordinary things we built. The hospitals and the surgery and the medications that kept her father alive for 16 years after the tractor accident that should have killed him. The phone in her pocket that could call for help from anywhere. All of it. She didn't want to give any of it back. But she thought about the price. The price of becoming people who explained everything. Who needed the language before they trusted the experience. Who had to have the logic of a thing before the thing was allowed to be real. Horses didn't pay that price. And in a particular October fog, at a particular moment, it was possible that a horse's refusal to negotiate with something that felt wrong had been the most sensible response available. She came out of the trail into the meadow at the top of the hill, and the morning opened around her, and the view was enormous, the valley below, the hills on the other side, the sky a pale and serious blue. Sable stopped on her own this time, the way she always did at the top, and Miriam led her, and they stood in the wind for a minute, both of them looking out at the wide world. "Good girl," Miriam said. Sable's ears swiveled back at the sound of her voice, then forward again, watching the valley. There is a particular kind of knowing that lives below the level of language. We have names for it, in various traditions and cultures and disciplines: instinct, intuition, the unconscious, the body's wisdom, the felt sense, the thin place, and the names are all slightly different and they all gesture at the same thing. The knowing that is older than words. That came before the elaborate architecture of human reason and will outlast it. That speaks in the language of sensation rather than argument. The sudden aversion with no apparent cause. The comfort in a place you've never been. The knowledge, specific and inexplicable, that a thing you have been told is safe is not safe, and a thing you have been told to fear is nothing to be afraid of. We have spent centuries trying to determine whether to trust it. The answer, probably, is the same as the answer to most questions about human experience. It's complicated. Our instincts are not infallible oracles. They carry biases, inherited fears, the accumulated baggage of a species that spent most of its history in genuine danger from a great many things, some of which are no longer threats. Our gut can be wrong. Confidently, persistently wrong. We know this. But the gut can also be right in ways that the mind is not equipped to process quickly enough to be useful. The gut can process a roomful of variables before the conscious mind has had time to notice the variables exist. The gut can read something that is wrong in a face or a space or a situation and sound the alarm while the logical self is still asking for more information. And when the gut and the horse agree, when the horse plants its feet and the gut says go, that is probably not the moment to ask for more information. Miriam still rides that trail. She told me this, or she told the version of herself that exists in the telling of this story, which is a different thing but not entirely different. She rides it in every season. She has never again seen what she saw in the fog. She has never again heard that sound. But she watches, now, the way she didn't before. Not with dread. Not with the kind of anxious vigilance that turns life into a waiting room for the next terrible thing. Just with attention. With the particular quality of attention that her grandmother had at the fence line, the noticing of how a place feels when nothing is watching. The building of a baseline, so that when the baseline shifts, you know. She pays attention to what Sable pays attention to. She trusts the horse. And if Sable stops, she stops. This is perhaps the simplest version of what this story is about. The question of which parts of your experience you are willing to take seriously. The question of where you draw the line between explaining and knowing. The question of what it costs you to dismiss your own oldest, most honest responses to the world, and whether what you get in return is worth the cost. There is something that stands at the edge of the fog and makes sounds it doesn't understand. There is something in us that sometimes knows, before we know how it knows, that what we're looking at is wrong. And there is a horse. Steady. Reliable. Standing absolutely still. Trembling. That's where Miriam was, on that October evening, when the world asked her a question that she couldn't answer in words. And what she did, simply, without drama, without looking back, was listen. The fog was far behind her before she let herself breathe normally again. And she rode home through the dark in the way you ride after something has confirmed a thing you already suspected about the world. Not frightened, exactly. Not relieved. Something more nuanced than either of those. Something that might be called a terrible, clarifying respect for the size of what exists, the size of what we don't know, the size of what has existed longer than our certainty, the size of the world that continues to be strange and various and deeply, unapologetically itself regardless of our frameworks for it. She brushed Sable down herself that evening, taking longer than usual, moving the brush in the long, slow strokes the horse liked. Sable stood with her eyes half closed and her lip loose with contentment, and Miriam worked in silence until the mare was done, and then she left the little extra grain in the bucket and latched the stall and walked back through the cold, clear night to the house. She left the lights off for a while. She sat at the kitchen window and looked at the dark hill and the dark sky and the cold scatter of stars, and she thought about her grandmother at the fence line. She thought about her grandmother standing there, in the clear spring day, knowing without being able to say how she knew. And she thought, I am the granddaughter of a woman who paid attention to the field. And I am trying to be worthy of that. The stars were very bright over the valley. A fox barked, somewhere distant on the hill, and was answered by silence. Miriam made tea. She slept, that night, without dreaming. And in the morning, She went out and looked in on Sable, who was eating her breakfast with her usual concentrated authority, and who looked up briefly with one deep, dark, knowing eye, and looked back down at her hay without apparent concern. The world was ordinary. Which was, Miriam had decided, the point. The world was mostly ordinary. It was ordinary more than it was anything else, and that ordinariness was something to be grateful for. It was something you could lean into. It was the warm, reliable current that carried you through the days. But sometimes the current shifts, and you need to be the kind of person who notices. You need to have built the kind of relationship with your own deep knowing that when it speaks, you hear it. When it plants its feet, you stop. When it trembles in the fog, you don't override it with logic or embarrassment or the fear of seeming foolish. You hear it. And you listen. Even if you can't explain it. Especially then. If this journey touched something in you, some quiet corner of experience that doesn't usually get this kind of attention, the comments are open, and they are genuinely one of the few places on the internet where people tell the truth about the strange and unexplained edges of their lives. What did you hear in the fog? What did you know before you knew? What animal, real or internal, has ever stopped you just in time? We are all people who have stood at the threshold of something we couldn't name. That's what this space is, a place to stand in that together, without pressure to explain, without the embarrassment of the inexplicable. Subscribe if you want to keep walking. We go out again soon. And wherever you are tonight, if there's fog, and something in you says stop, trust the horse. Just go.